it's a sunny day. Not a cloud in the sky, kind of like today. And all the kids are outside, screaming, running around, playing cops and robbers, or whatever it was we used to play. And I am sitting inside on my bed, cross-legged, with a giant children's illustrated Bible on my lap. And that was my beginning, my path to ministry. Because I was, even at that tiny little age of 6, 7, 8, all the way up through my teens, I was so curious about this book that had these conflicting stories about a loving God and a non-loving God and a judgmental God and a loving God who sends his son to die for us. It didn't make a whole bunch of sense, but I was still enthralled by it. And the pictures, oh my goodness, the picture of the temptation of Jesus had this image of the devil with this red cape behind him, and I can still picture it today. And 5 years ago, almost to this day, I was ordained as a Unity minister. And I want to share a little bit about how that came to be, how I made sense of these conflicting stories, and how, in many ways, the story can be broken into 3 sort of segments, which I think we might all be able to identify with. The first segment was this discovery of a passion. I used to, when we played cops and robbers, I would volunteer to be the prisoner so that I could sit under the tree and read my book while all they did was run around like crazy people. I grew up in the Anglican tradition. My mom, a very staunch, very loyal Anglican who to this day reads her Bible every night before going to sleep. I was involved in our church's youth group, the choir at any church that I was involved in, the Bible studies that would be at school when everybody else was, gossiping and stuff like that. I would go to Bible study at my breaks at lunch and prayer groups. Who does that? I know, Ronnie. It should have been a clue that there was something I really longed to do. But the idea of calling myself a minister was way out of my realm. Because when I saw ministers in the Anglican Church, they were always dressed in these beautiful vestments. They always looked bigger than real life. And I remember the shock I felt when I first saw the minister in jeans, because it never really occurred to me that they were people too. They always had this greatness about them, this aura of holiness about them that kind of set them apart from us mere mortals. Does that make sense? I see a few nods. Some of you experience this as well. It's kind of like when you see one of your school teachers at the grocery store and you realize that they're more than just the teacher that you see at school. So that same feeling.
I felt the same way about police officers.
You felt the same way about police officers, Walt? There's a story I'm not sure that we are ready for. They used to call Walt Speedy. And he grew up in Brooklyn, say no more. There was a time, though, that I started to really get into reading the Bible. And I remember reading Proverbs every night. Again, who does that? But every night I would read some of Proverbs, just for interest. And there's it's really, really wonderful poetry and interesting ideas. But what was really fascinating is that at some level, I noticed that my life was flowing more smoothly, and I had no idea why. It's not like anything magically big happened, but I noticed that as I was reading these Proverbs, it's as if my life flowed more smoothly. And at some level, again, there was a recognition that one might have something to do with the other. This reading might actually have been shifting me in some way, and life just felt more smooth. But, I was a teenager, and that thought was planted as a little seed, but not really nurtured. But I never really forgot it either. And so I had this longing and loving for Scripture, for Jesus, for the teachings of Jesus, for the whole scriptural experience from Genesis all the way through to the end of this children's illustrated Bible. I was like, there's something here. And I loved it. Praying to God, saying all of this, the rote prayers that we would say every week at the Anglican Church. And then I moved into phase 2 of what I think of as this journey. This movement from discovering of a passion to a bit of a disillusionment. Because I started to pay attention to some of the words that I was saying every week. And they were things like, "We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table." And there was a part of me that thought, this is a little extreme. The idea that I'm not worthy to gather up the crumbs under God's table. It's also kind of insulting to God. We look at flowers and we see beauty. We look at everything around us and we see beauty, but somehow we are not worthy. At the same time that we're told that we're made in the image and likeness of God, it didn't make sense. And it was also insulting, as I say, to God. It was as if, God, you did everything else right, but with humans you created an inferior product. And it did not compute for me. Neither did it compute for me that God sent his only begotten Son to die on the cross 2,000 years ago for something that I am doing now. Neither did it make sense to me that a child who had never believed or heard of Jesus was going to suffer in eternal damnation because of that. So I started to question. And with no disrespect to people who believe that, because if you believe that and it makes you feel better, then God love you. But it was starting to not work for me. And a tipping point happened. one Sunday at an Anglican church that I went to in Saskatoon. And the minister was talking about the guest speaker next week. And he said, God has cured her of her illness. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, because she is lesbian. And it was the only time that I was tempted in my entire life to get up and leave. And because I was raised politely, I didn't. But I didn't go back. And for many years, moved here to Vancouver, I didn't go back to a church. And when I did go back, the language hit me harder and harder as, no, this is not something that fits for me anymore. So that was phase 2. It was this disillusionment about the longing that I had. This, something's there, but it's not quite fitting for me anymore. Then, thankfully, I left the door open a little, because I was chatting with a friend, somebody who we were in a class together. We came together for this class. I've never seen or heard from her for years since. But in that class, we were chatting at coffee after, and I was telling her some of this disillusionment and how I struggle, because I still love my Jesus. I still love these stories. I still think there's something there, but I can't reconcile it with the teachings that I'm hearing. And she said, oh, you should go try Unity. There's this place I go to, they take the stories of Jesus and they transform them into something that is not about judgment. It is not about lacking empowerment. And that is how I walked in to Unity of White Rock. And it was Halloween, and I was greeted by a witch, and the musician was Little Red Riding Hood, and they had everything set up, and it was like, oh, this is cool. But more than cool, it was meaningful. And I could wrap my head around a different way of approaching my longing. I discovered Unity's interpretation of God, which Jesus speaks about himself when he says in Matthew that the sun rises on the evil and the good, and the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. That God is everywhere. God is all. That God is both wave and particle. That God is both matter and non-matter, potential energy and physical energy. That God is transcendent, bigger than we can ever experience and understand, and immanent, as close as we are, because we are God in expression. That there is no place that creative energy is not. Oh, this makes more sense to me. And yesterday, I happened to be at a Roman Catholic funeral. And one of the readings they had was from the second book of Corinthians, chapter 4, and it clicked for me. I went looking for it. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. So this is to bring comfort to people who have now passed away, right? The idea of fixing our eyes on what is unseen. since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Yeah, we change. Life changes, the planet changes, the weather changes. Energy never changes, it shifts. That's what I believe that this passage is referring to. It's what I take from it. My journey started when I was this little. That longing, and then that disillusionment, and then that rediscovery happened at many levels. The level I've spoken to you about was the actual experience of the teachings and the philosophy and the dogma, if you will, of traditional Christian religion, and how it just didn't fit for me anymore. Now I can still love my Jesus, but I see him differently than many others. Bless you.
Bless you.
You are blessed. And yet it also happened on another level, and that is the level of my own self-worth, perhaps. And that is, I longed to be a minister, but it was always going to be too big, too greater than who I am. And I made sure that I was really good at every career I ever did. And one day, maybe, I'll be a minister. It was always going to happen one day. And then life kind of had a way of making sure that was not going to happen one day. I was going to be granted the opportunity to step into it before I thought I was ready. And so that turning away, that distraction, that finding other things to do was no longer there. It got sucked away from me. And then it was like a real strong, what are you going to do now? Are you ready now? Step in now. And even so, it took a while for me to decide to go to school and become ordained. Even so, I had questions and phone calls to a friend saying, am I doing the right thing? And her saying, you know, this is called upper limiting. You're limiting yourself. Step up. Anyway. And I wonder if that story isn't true for some of us here. That there is something that you may know is yours to do, something that you know that you long for, and that you're turning away from. And is there a place where you might take a little step towards it? Doesn't have to be giving up your job or anything massive. But take a step towards discovering and rediscovering your passion. See if you can find a way to bring that gift, because it is a gift, back into your life. See if you can stay open to that eternal longing that you have within you. It's been a few years since I sat on that bed. Now I think back, I'm like, you wasted a day in the sun? But I'm so very grateful for that memory and that experience and the discovery of that longing. I'm so very grateful that I questioned and stayed open. Even through my disillusionment, there was a part of me that never lost that dream. And I'm so grateful that I didn't turn completely away from it. I love my work because it's not work. It's discovery. It's interesting. It's chatting with people. It's chatting with myself. It's reading and getting deeper and deeper into stories that look like nothing on the surface. It's exciting. And I love sharing these discoveries with you, because that brightens my day too. What a privilege it is that I get to do something I love so much. And my dream for each of you is that you experience that same joy, that same reward. That is how I got to here. I bless you.